start? Okay, I think we're about ready to begin. If everyone wants to take a seat. Our final panel today is going to look a little bit more into the future. We've spent the past day and a half talking a lot about where the EU stands, how it is evolving, its institutional challenges. And this afternoon, we're going to turn our focus a little bit more to the EU's borders and beyond, in fact, and talk about the future of the EU's relations, not just with the UK, but also with Turkey, with the Ukraine, enlargement, and where this EU train is going. And joining us this afternoon on the panel are Steven Blockmans, who is a specialist from the Center for European Policy Studies. Steven has just published a book called The Obsolescence of the European Neighborhood Policy, which is a very provocative title. He writes that the European neighborhood policy is now little more than an elegantly crafted fig leaf that purports to take a soft power approach to the EU's periphery, but in effect, it inclines more towards realpolitik. Sitting next to Steven, we have Svitlana Kobzar. Svitlana is Ukrainian and comes from the European Endowment for Democracy. She is also an assistant professor at Vesalius College in Brussels. Svitlana, as you might expect, is a proponent of Ukrainian accession to the EU one day, and wrote recently that taking a long view and making a truly strategic commitment to involve Ukrainians in the European project can help the country turn the corner. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Sitting next to Svitlana is Professor Atila Eralp from Turkey. He is professor of Middle East at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, and also a fellow at the Istanbul Policy Center at Sabancı University. Professor Eralp has been a sort of long observer, as you might guess, of Turkish relations with the EU, and he was one of the first, it seems, who sensed many years ago that Turkish relations with Europe might not be going on the same trajectory as many in Europe believed at the time. And he wrote in 2012, whether Turkey's relationship with the EU has gone from being seen as a strategic vision into a framework for a useful but just another partnership in international relations will become clear in the coming years. And I think today we can look back and say that there has been a quite dramatic shift in Turkey's relationship with the EU. Next to Professor Eralp, we have Ambassador Poul Christoffersen, who many of you know, a long-time Danish diplomat who was right at the center of the EU enlargement negotiations that led to the inclusion of the 10 Central and Eastern European countries in 2004, including, of course, Estonia. He also played a key role in the External Action Service in setting that up, and was also a longtime Danish representative to the EU, and was one of the people, maybe the main person who helped craft the famous opt-outs for Denmark. And in 2015, he wrote a column at the time in December when the UK was thinking about how to, or David Cameron rather, was thinking about how he could keep the UK in the European Union. And at the time, Ambassador Christoffersen wrote a column arguing that they should follow Denmark's blueprint under the headline, "Here's how Britain can get a good deal." So I look forward to hearing your predictions today on how these other countries can get a good deal from the EU. Ambassador, I'd like to start with you. Maybe you can give us some of your thoughts on the topic and where you think Europe is headed in terms of its external relations to these countries and beyond?
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here in this country, in this capital. Having had the occasion to be permanent representative and in the Danish presidency in 2002 when we concluded the enlargement negotiation, I'm very happy to see that I was right in the sense that it was time to conclude the enlargement negotiations, and those with whom we concluded at the time would become a big success in the future. And that is still my belief, despite the various difficulties which we see with Hungary and Poland. Overall, it was the right thing to do, and we couldn't have waited any longer doing it. But now, since you are referring to a quote where I said something on Brexit, I think if you read the article, the advice which I gave to David Cameron was that if you wanted to succeed in that endeavor, you needed some kind of national compromise inside the UK, because that was when we were in real trouble after having said no to the Maastricht Treaty. I think the key was that we made a compromise among all the political parties on how to get through that complicated situation. That is certainly not an advice that has been followed, and maybe is one of the reasons why the UK is in the situation in which it is. If I should, in very short term, describe how I see the future relations with the EU. Maybe I would start by saying that this session is framed circles of European integration and disintegration. I don't believe very much in the theory of circles. And I think, I haven't read Stephen's book, but what he's saying that to treat everybody in the same way is a fig leaf, and that it is realpolitik that counts today. That goes for the UK, but it certainly also goes for Turkey and Ukraine. Theresa May said in her famous Florence speech that her ambition was a long-term agreement which was less than Norway, but more ambitious than Canada. My guess is that what the UK can inspire to get will be Canada. It might be Canada Plus in the sense that the agreement probably will cover a larger scope than the Canada agreement, inter alia, because there will be a chapter on foreign policy, there will be a chapter on internal and external community, but I don't see any possibility of an agreement with the UK, which, for instance, on internal market issues, given the attitude in the UK, could go much further than the Canada agreement. You hear very often in the UK this thought that, well, today we are so close together, we have the same norms and standards, so why is it so complicated? Can we not just have some kind of arbitration mechanism at a time when we might tend to diverge? But this is really not possible. I mean, that would be to give the UK a say over UK legislation on the internal market, and a say which would be greater than, for instance, the one that than Norway than Norway has. I mean, if you want to regain, if the UK wants to regain autonomy, they have to accept the consequences. And that means, in my opinion, a Canada-type agreement. There are also some that think that we can use some of the other models that exist. For instance, the Ukraine model has been mentioned, including by people in Brussels. I think the attraction of the Ukrainian model for the United Kingdom is that it gives free access to the internal market without free movement of labor. But sorry, folks, that type of deal is not possible with the UK. It's possible with Ukraine simply because we don't want free movement of labor. But it is impossible to see an agreement which would give access to the internal market without a free movement of labor part. Then turning to the rest, and maybe addressing the question whether enlargement still is a part of our external policy. Is there an enlargement perspective for anybody? I was actually surprised when Juncker in his speech mentioned the possibility that we would now start up with enlargement with the Balkan states. I was not so surprised about what he said, but I was surprised by the lack of reaction in the public. Because my sentiment about enlargement and the general feeling in the European public for the moment is that there is an enormous enlargement fatigue, and that it is has become much more difficult than it was in 2002 to 2004. There are many reasons for that. One of the reasons is maybe that the 2014 enlargement did not turn out quite as was expected, for instance, on the free movement of persons. I think at the time we expected more or less the same thing to happen as happened at the time with Spain and Portugal, that the stream of workers actually would be going back to their home countries, which has not been the case. I think there's also a feeling that enlargement, certainly the enlargement with Romania and Bulgaria, came too early, and that we have seen negative results of that. So I think the general feeling is very much hesitation towards further enlargement. What consequence would I draw if I were a candidate from that? I think I would draw the same consequence as, for instance, some of the 2004 waves countries did at the beginning of the process, after the fall of the wall. At that time, there was nobody that really thought that these countries were ripe for enlargement. That enlargement were at best a perspective that would be 10 or 20 years down the horizon. And why did that change? It changed because of the candidate countries. It changed because the reform in the candidate countries was much more rapid than we had expected. It changed because the inward investments was important. So it was actually the efforts of the candidate countries that forced the Union to then decide in Copenhagen that enlargement was actually a possibility. And it was the same thing that happened, for instance, when we decided to move from the 6 countries we had originally thought would be in the first wave and into the regatta model. It was because countries like Lithuania and Latvia, in fact, made much more progress than we had expected. So the best advice to the two sitting in the middle is that if you want to increase your possibility of one day becoming a member of the European Union, you have to do your homework and do it better than the EU actually require. That was the recipe followed by Estonia at the time. That was the recipe followed by Poland at the time. And I would say that that is your only chance. And that will be my last comment, and maybe I can come back later. The idea which sometimes seems present is that you have to be recompensated on each step you take. That in order to do reform on anti-corruption and privatization, you need visa liberalization. If we need to do the next steps that require further agricultural concession, that will not work. It is only you as a country that can possibly one day make it attractive and maybe inevitable that you become a member of the European Union. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's interesting that the Merkelian German advice to do your homework has really taken hold across Europe these days. Professor Eralp, continue with you, please.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind invitation. It's always delightful to be in Tallinn. Turkey is mostly discussed as an exceptional or a unique case, you know. But the discussions yesterday and today showed that, you know, there are certain general trends which connect Turkey to other experiences. There are some elements related to Turkey, but there are also some general trends which connect, you know, Turkey to other experiences. So it seems to me more relevant to locate the debate on Turkey in terms of general trends. And I would like to contextualize the debate on Turkey in terms of global trends, European dynamics, and then also focus on Turkey. First, let me start with some global trends. We face a turbulent system, which is in major transformation. And when we look at the striking trends in this transformation, we witness the rise of a multipolar system, which is not the traditional type of a multipolar system. It is more multicentric with new actors, and these include not only state actors, but transnational actors, societal actors, all kinds of different actors, and there are also new issues in the international system. Secondly, we also observe the decline, relative decline of the West, including Europe. You know, there is, when you look at economically, politically, you see a certain decline of the West. The West is unable to shape global politics anymore. Third, we also observe patterns of cooperation and conflict simultaneously in the international system. And this is a major challenge, you know, when you have both patterns acting simultaneously. And fourthly, there are close linkages between the international and the domestic, and it is extremely difficult to separate domestic from the international. And as we have been discussing, we see the rise of illiberal tendencies in the international system, which is even characterized as rise of competitive authoritarianism, you know, as we discussed in the case of Poland, Hungary, and other cases. And as we also discussed, there are multiple crises affecting the international system, not only economic, with problems of the neoliberal system and rise of protectionism, but also, you know, as we have been discussing, political problems, rise of populism, nationalism, unilateralism, bilateralism, sectarianism, all kinds of isms are shaping the international system, and there is a rise of violence, as we see, not only in the Middle East, but in different regions as well. There are also major social crises, such as the refugee crisis, but it's a reflection of some of the major social challenges in the international system. When we look at Europe, Europe faces all these major challenges and probably faces all these challenges more than other actors because the European system is of a multilateral system, and the multilateral system faces more difficulties in the context of these multiple crises because multiple crises turns actors inward, you know. There's an inward orientation which results, as we have been discussing again, in the rise of populist tendencies and politics of fear, you know. So this is also becoming an important phenomena in Europe, which was reflected in the Brexit discussions in France, in Germany, in other places as well, you know. So we see all kinds of, as we have been discussing, populist tendencies and politics of fear. But let me be a bit optimistic here. Europe has derived important lessons from crisis, faced major crises, not in the last 10 years, but even before, and derived important lessons. And therefore, Europe needs to sustain its multilateral orientation, which is very important in the international system, but it has to complement it with a more outward orientation. There is a danger that Europe is turning more inward, but I think in the turbulent international system, Europe needs to be more outward looking. And in terms of European tendencies, I see that Europe has the highest potential in the international system to create partnerships, which are quite important in the turbulent international system. In a multicentric, multilateral system, you need partnerships, and Europe, compared to other actors, still has a highest potential, an important potential to create such partnerships. However, when I look at these partnerships, they should not remain at the governmental level, you know. When you look at the recent global strategy or the neighborhood review, you see too much focus on the governmental level, you know. The partnership relations should include societal actors. And when I look at globally and also in Europe, there is an increasing demand for rule of law, justice and democracy. And as a result, the European model is still quite attractive in the international system. But I think these partnership relations should address more socio-economic challenges and issues of social and economic inequality. And when I look at the future of Europe debate, the future of Europe debate should also focus more on socio-economic challenges and also focus more on outward orientation. Now, after making those general comments on global trends and the European dynamics, let me focus also briefly on Turkey. When I look at the case of Turkey, Turkey is affected from these global trends, from European dynamics, but also Turkey affects some of these trends, you know. In Turkey, as was discussed in other cases, you see the rise of political polarization, you see the rise of all kinds of inequalities, you know, social and economic inequalities. You see the rise of populism, you see rise of authoritarian tendencies, you see problems with rule of law, as we see in other cases. And for a long time, the EU anchor was quite important in the context of Turkey, but now, in the last couple of years, we see a dramatic decline of the EU anchor, and EU is losing its relevance in the Turkish context. But we should not forget that not a long time ago, Turkey was characterized as a success story. You know, I mean, this was only like 4 or 5 years ago. Turkey was characterized all over. And when we had discussions, you know, when we are trying to show some of the nuances, people in Europe and in the Middle East were saying that Turkey is really a model, it's a success story. So we should not forget that. And we should not forget that Turkey-EU relationship is a long-lasting one, you know. I mean, the present is important, but it goes long way, and when we look at this relationship, it has its ups and downs, you know. We had some up periods, and now we are in a down period. So I could say that we should try to avoid focusing too much on the current affairs. We should avoid what I call presentism, you know, focusing on the present too much, and look at it more in terms of the historical context of the relationship. In that sense, there is hope in the relationship when you look at it in the historical context. And also, we should try to avoid as much as possible, again, equating Turkey with the current leadership. You know, when I look at the debates in Europe, you know, on Turkey, it is always equated with the current leadership, with Erdogan, and looking at some of the problems there, you know. But Turkey is more complex and more diverse, you know. This was reflected in some of the current debates in Turkey, in the referendum, in April referendum. So Turkey is more complex and diverse, and one should take that into account. And thirdly, we should again avoid the talks on suspension and termination of the EU accession process. Again, there's a big discussion on this now in Brussels and elsewhere, you know. But this discussion, when you look at it, you know, it helps only those who like to show that Europe does not want Turkey. You know, it helps those, let's say, social and economic and political forces who that emphasize that Europe does not want Turkey. So let me conclude by saying that engagement with Turkey is still important, and it is still important to create partnership relations with Turkey. But as I was making the point, these partnership relationships should not remain at the governmental level, but should try to include societal actors more. And as I was saying, you know, there is an increasing demand for rule of law, justice, and democracy by societal actors in Turkey, and this should be supported through engagement with Turkey. And finally, my point in terms of conclusion is that there is a need for inclusionary mechanisms, and this was discussed yesterday, but it was discussed in the context of Europe, you know, need for inclusionary mechanisms in Europe. But I think it is also important to create inclusionary mechanisms in relation to candidate countries, neighboring countries, and even third countries, you know. And I think in the models of flexible integration, this is one of the important challenges that should be addressed, how to include really neighbors, you know, candidates and third countries in the institutional mechanisms. I would conclude by that.
Thank you very much. I thought your comment that the EU is losing its relevance in the Turkish context was quite interesting. We'll come back to that in a moment. But Svitlana, would you like to give us the Ukrainian view on all of this?
Thank you very much to the organizers of this conference and for the opportunity to be here. I think actually several of the comments will actually feed into the discussions that has been taking place in the previous panels and what has been already said on this panel. Because before this conference, when I was reflecting on the questions of what are the potential models of relationship with the aspiring members and if there is prospect for enlargement, a few themes appeared immediately in my mind. And so I wanted to be transparent and spell it out before I delve into the details. The first is that, and it's been echoed already, is that we live in times of uncertainty. It's nothing special. It has happened many times before. But we wouldn't have been able to foresee exactly the fall of the Berlin Wall or the collapse of the Soviet Union, even though you may have people saying after the effect that actually I knew it all along. And I think that in these times of uncertainty, we need to also recognize that it provides a certain void where a certain course forward narratives strategy can be taken forward. And this is an important responsibility that we can take. And I think this conference is a timely one to reflect and have food for thought. It's also important to recognize that EU aspirations, as already has been mentioned in the case of Turkey, shouldn't be taken for granted. We are dealing with the neighborhood and with aspiring countries which are very dynamic, and things are not constant there. And at the times when there are aspirations, it should be recognized, and it should be maximum tools developed to really take advantage of those windows of opportunity. Now, if I focus specifically on Ukraine, it's been mentioned, I think, on the panel on economy is that a lot of the factors are interrelated. We're talking about identity issues when we're talking also about European integration and economic integration and the desire to pursue integration. And in the case of Ukraine, we have a lot of discussions about what is happening now, what are the ways forward. But I think this conference provides an interesting opportunity to sit back at least for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and to also reflect how come Ukraine even aspires to be member of the EU? How come this EU idea has been there? And for me, also arriving here for the Estonian presidency is really quite interesting and inspiring in itself, because as I mentioned, in the area of uncertainty several years ago, the return to Europe was also present here. So what makes Ukraine at this point different? How has it arrived to this point? And what has the idea of Europe meant? Well, Ukraine is a late bloomer in that respect. The return to Europe wasn't as strong after the collapse of the Soviet Union as was the case for this part of the world, for this part of Europe, let's say. And it's not surprising. 90% or so, if I can generalize, of the ruling elite of the post-Soviet Ukraine were just changing hats from the Soviet nomenclature to the ruling elite of Ukraine. Ukraine did have a dissident movement. It has had a national idea beforehand, but the dissident movement wasn't in power, and so there wasn't a big push among the ruling elite at that time for a realistic and really a reinvigorated push for return to Europe. Interestingly, then we had a second president, Leonid Kuchma, who was elected in '94. And when he was elected, he was very much depicted, if you read the statements from those times, if we look into history, as was advised as well by the speakers today, is that he was elected on a platform which was depicted as pro-Russian. He had assets, he came from more of, let's say, the southeastern part of Ukraine. And interestingly, he was elected in '94, but by 1996, he already proclaimed the idea of Europe in Ukraine. There are many reasons for doing that. There was already a difficult relationship with Russia that was below the radar because it wasn't a bloody conflict at that time, but there were tensions that were becoming simmering on certain issues. Kuchma was not really a democratic leader, and corruption was rampant at that time. So some analysts argued that it was declarative Europeanization. So there was a talk, but not the walk. And that, in a way, was also suitable for European leaders, because you had a country which said European talk, but didn't really demand a real action in terms of having a real membership prospect. There was just more rhetorical. But at the same time, it did planted certain seeds that there is this model, EU integration model, which can be part of modernization path. And so for a certain number of society, there was a growing understanding that this can be a way forward to modernize and to serve as a model for Ukrainian development. There was Kuchma's second term was finished with a tumultuous events, as we recall, the Orange Revolution. As some say, every nation has several defining moments, and Ukraine has had a few. And the Orange Revolution there, the idea of Europe was quite present as well, and it was even more defined with connecting it to democratization, to the rule of law, and to having a fair system. However, it didn't bear the results. On the one hand, you had the West, which was supportive of the movement to have fair elections and supportive of the post-Orange coalition, but the coalition itself didn't hold. And also, there was no membership perspective. There was not really a massive push to really provide a huge support for Ukraine beyond some symbolic and some actions that were taken, but not in a way that it was really met with the return to Europe that we had in the 1990s. For the countries. Most recently, we've had the Revolution of Dignity, and it has become an important milestone for Ukraine. And there are several aspects which make this time quite different from the previous steps. For one is that society demanded change, but several members of the society, civil society, young activists, they didn't just demand change, but they joined the change. So we see several young MPs who were just in their 20s during the Orange Revolution, who are now in their 30s, who are part of the governing process. They're struggling, they're still in minority, but they're there. And this new generation of leaders, for them, the Soviet Union is a history, it's not a memory. And it makes a big difference for the movement for Europe that should be also quite recognized. It's also important to know that the sacrifice of the revolution of dignity and the subsequent war is much higher, and it will also take time for it to set in for the Ukrainian society, but the EU should also be aware. When you watch on TV how many shellings are happening every day, when you watch on TV the caskets someone receiving from the front line, it has a ripple effect on society, and that sacrifice will have a long-term impact on Ukraine's relationship with Russia and also for its drive to pursue EU integration that should be appreciated. At the same time, of course, it's very difficult, as we mentioned, with the push for reform, and we should recognize how just difficult it is. You have a basic disbalance in power. You have a few who have a lot to lose, and you have a lot who are not empowered, but who have a lot to gain from EU integration. And that fight is very real, and sometimes we have a rule of force rather than rule of law. Like we have some of our partners in Kharkiv who work on anti-corruption who were beaten up, but they still managed to return 158 hectares of land to the city authority just recently. So that fight is real, and there are lots of changes happen, but for the EU it's also important to recognize what then can be done to support that. Because ultimately, the revolution of dignity, I don't want to oversimplify it, but it showed a distrust in Ukrainian government, and Ukrainians in general have distrust in authority. They've been ruled by external powers for many years. So there's a distrust of authority. At the same time, there was trust in the European integration project. It didn't cause the revolution to happen. There were many factors there. But the trust in the European project was definitely part of what drove there. Just briefly, what it means now for us reflecting here and for the EU. First thing, it's really important to be patient and to recognize that countries such as Ukraine are going through a generational transformation. It will take time. Asking questions, are we fatigued, are we not? It's not sort of asking an afternoon question, like, am I ready for a snack? You know, this is a long-term, very difficult process, and people are really doing as much as they can in a civil society front. It's hard to predict what exactly the tipping point for change is. It always is, and even futuristic studies will fool ourselves if we know that it's for sure that we can predict what the change will happen. But we can analyze what are the drivers of change, positive change in this respect. And here we can see that there are some drivers of change in Ukraine taking place now, even with not membership perspective. And that's the people, the civil society, the human capital, which is one of the best capital that Ukraine has. The question is, as with any natural resource, and for Ukraine it's human capital, is how do you make use of it? That will also matter. And here I think for the EU, it's important to build on the momentum and the timing, which is quite crucial, to be realistic about the challenges, because you have a situation where we operate in the geopolitical reality. It's just a reality, it's there, we can't deny it. At the same time, we shouldn't be blinded by this reality, and we should not look at the rhetoric, geopolitical rhetoric, but at the actions of what is taking place and what reforms are taking place. At the same time, we've been talking a lot about corruption, and there's a lot of effort in anti-corruption. But we should also recognize that Ukraine's biggest problem is that it's very difficult to do modernization on its own. And if we look at the past modernization, including in Central and Eastern Europe, it's a very difficult thing to do on your own. Membership perspective, of course, it's idealistic, but we have to be realistic that it opens a lot of other financial mechanisms that are beyond just even EU direct investment, and there's foreign direct investment and private sector which flows into it. At the same time, it's also important to recognize that for Ukraine, being in this gray zone or being the bridge is not a panacea for conflict resolution. It has been more of a curse, right? I mean, Ukraine has been a bridge and has tried to muddle through. And so instead of trying to prescribe this as a solution, we have to see that actually this has not worked for Ukraine. And to what extent it will be strong enough to withstand and to balance these pressures will be quite difficult. So to conclude, as I mentioned, that for Ukraine, the best natural resources is its people. I think here, if there's not a membership perspective on the table, it will be very important to recognize, at least in the short term, Eastern Partnership Summit and so on, is what are the concrete tools for investing in the people that are realistic. Of course, recognizing European aspiration should be quite I think, straightforward. I mean, this is really difficult for people in Ukraine to understand, considering all the sacrifices, that this language is so controversial, considering that, you know, it's there. Ukraine has European aspirations. Making the most of the available tool. No one is asking to exactly compensate for every step, but certain steps for Ukraine are very difficult. For example, if you implement DCFTA, there are very high costs for certain parts, members of real economy in Ukraine, finding ways to inject that support into real economy, integrating further the higher education, the research, and small and medium enterprises with the European businesses is another tool. Ultimately, just to concluding statement, I think we have to recognize that for Ukraine, staying democratic while building a nation and defending a state is difficult and is going to be messy. And we should be prepared for that and then design tools in creative, bold way to fill this void of uncertainty to really help the partner. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn the floor to Stephen. Stephen, put it all in perspective for us.
I'll try.
Where is this going?
Thanks, first of all, to the organizers for inviting me to Tallinn. It's great to be back and see friends. I would like indeed to go back to the original question for this panel and talk a little bit about the disintegration of neighborhood policies as we see them, and start indeed with the ENP, which I indeed think is obsolete by now as a policy. Mm-hmm. That is not to say that there's no merit in projecting aims, as Svitlana has described it very well, for countries that share ambitions for closer association and indeed integration. That is not to say that there is not a helpful toolbox in order to assist in that process. It is merely to say that the European Union is constrained by technocratic processes and procedures which seem to only now be infused with a sense of politics, which they dearly needed. And in that process, there is fragmentation going on. To start with the ENP, as a result of the so-called Arab Spring, there was already a review in 2011 of the European Neighborhood Policy. Then again, as a result of Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine, we've seen a new review in 2015. With all kinds of concepts being floated, more for more conditionality, less for less, an emphasis on trying to promote deep democracy, which was then shedded again in 2015, and now with an increasing emphasis on differentiation in bilateral relations on the basis of ownership of the countries concerned and indeed own merits-based approaches in forging closer ties with one another. This practice, in a way, moves the ENP further away from its stated ambition in the treaty itself. Article 8 prescribes what is maybe a land of milk and honey, but at least a long-term perspective for an area, meaning one area, if I, as a lawyer, interpret that line strictly, an area of peace, stability, and prosperity. Look at the European neighborhood and the somber realities that characterize it as of today. And of course, we're a long way off that mark. That is not to say that we should discard that long-term ambition. It is a goal worth working towards, but the method which is being chosen should not be one of a one-size-fits-all policy, which, by the way, has been broken up, fragmented, if you want, in several instances already. We have, for the East, an Eastern Partnership with 6 countries of which only 3 have an association agreement with a deep and comprehensive free trade area embedded within them. We now have Armenia, which was forced, of course, to renege on its association agreement at first and join the Eurasian Economic Union, which is now negotiated some type of a bastard type of association agreement, a truncated association agreement in DCFTA, so as to be able to still meet the criteria of the Eurasian Economic Customs Union. Differentiation, sure. This is what DG NIR would emphasize in this, in this respect. Belarus, Azerbaijan, entirely different cases. Yet again, look at the south. Well, there is a project-driven Union for the Mediterranean, which the Israelis like because it's the only platform to meet with Palestinians. But it's not the type of European stability pact as we had it for the Western Balkans, which was very active and indeed managed to change affairs at a grassroots level. With the 2015 review of the ENP, we see an increasing emphasis on what is described also in the European Global Strategy as principled pragmatism. I find that a very difficult notion to understand, but it effectively means that the European Union is prioritizing stability, security first, fundamental rights and freedoms second, even if human rights are proclaimed to be an interest integral to the European Union, and of course embedded in the very values on which the European Union is based, and which builds a nice link to the internal-external dialectic in dealing with values, promotion and protection in both EU foreign policy, neighborhood policy, as well as internally, Hungary and Poland. One final aspect of this ENP is that if you look deeper into the association agreements and especially the DCFTAs, the deep and comprehensive free trade areas or arrangements that form the core of these agreements, then you come to realize that in their material substance, as well as in the transition periods for approximation to the EU's acquis, the association agreements in the case of Ukraine, certainly in the case of Moldova, to be understood from their perspective being close to Romania, a member state, these obligations enter into by the countries concerned with the full consent of the European Commission, it should be added, and the member states in council signing off on them, are much further reaching than the stabilization and association agreements, their obligations and transition periods, for example, with Serbia. Now, you would say that, sure, these countries still have an accession treaty to negotiate before they can actually enter into the European Union, and that's what's not on offer exactly for neighboring states, everything but the institutions, as Prodi's line goes. I think it's testament to the fact that nevertheless in their material substance and the commitments entered into the ENP, the European Neighborhood Policy, and the enlargement policy, which will not translate for the Western Balkan states into membership before 2025, which was the date mentioned, it seems, by Juncker in the State of the Union speech for the frontrunners in that process, Serbia and Montenegro. That type of prospect is blurring the boundaries between those policies, I would argue, and make them less relevant as conceptual contexts in order and technocratic processes to steer relations with neighborhood states. The enlargement process itself is highly bilateralized, if you want. It's an own merit-driven approach, and rightly so, indeed, Paul. The candidate countries should do their homework before they can accede. And at the end, there will always be a political decision to make them enter, without, however, having them import bilateral, territorial, or recognition problems into the EU. We should have learned those lessons from the past. Turkey is often forgotten in this context. We talk about enlargement, we think immediately about the Western Balkans, and in many of the speeches, that's also where the emphasis, the geographical emphasis lies. Turkey, I think for good reason, is separated in this context, and I've heard Professor Eralp's passionate plea in that sense. I'm of a much stricter opinion in that sense, that it's not just time for suspension of accession talks, but termination of those talks. And I think there are good arguments to actually make that claim. Turkey has had ample time since 1963. Of course, there was also counterbalance on the EU and its individual member states that have stunted progress in all those decades towards closer association and integration. But Turkey has had ample time to prove its worth. In 1999, a historic decision was taken in Helsinki to open accession negotiations. They were then postponed until 2005, and effectively we've now had 12 years of accession negotiations, which are a game of charades, as far as I can see. They're frozen in content, effectively frozen in content. They're not going anywhere. And in fact, if internal developments in Turkey are anything to go by, which to my mind is structural and will last for the better part of this decade and the next, for as long as Erdogan controls an increasingly authoritarian state where the separation of powers is completely blurred and where effectively he and his Praetorian Guard and clique around him are calling the shots. That, to my mind, is an authoritarian state. It is there to stay. The direction of travel in Turkey is the other way around from what we would expect from a candidate country. And I think also this brings back the value debate we have internally. If we're serious about upholding political criteria to candidate countries, then we have to come to the conclusion that Turkey is not meeting those criteria and will continue not to meet them for quite a while. If we're serious about maintaining a membership perspective for those countries in the enlargement process that do try to effectuate change, positive change, then we cannot afford the enlargement process from being eroded by measuring with two standards, basically. For Turkey. Turkey is, the values are an irrefutable DNA of the EU, both internally as well as externally, and that is what I think should be kept in mind.
Could we stop right there, because I think this is really a central point and gets right to the core of this question. I mean, we've been talking about it for the past couple of days, all of the issues that the EU has to shoulder at the moment. Is this really the time to be talking about accession of any country? Or is it time to, as you say, kind of look the facts in the face and say we have to terminate the accession talks with Turkey because we need a new paradigm there. We need a new overall strategy in terms of how we're going to deal with these countries, in terms of how we're going to deal with the Ukraine and even the Balkans. Ambassador Christoffersen, I'd like to come back to you on that. What is your view of this?
Well, as far as Turkey is concerned, I agree that enlargement negotiations cannot go on at the present time. Whether you call it a definitive halt or you call it a freezing.
Or what about termination? Because I mean, I think the point here is that it's always been a stick, or it's rather been a carrot, not a stick, and it hasn't really worked in Turkey's case. And you could make the argument that it's not working elsewhere the way that it used to.
Well, of course, if we are talking about using Article 7 towards Poland, there's no way in which we can contemplate enlargement with a country like Turkey for the moment. So that, of course, would call for complete interruption of the process. What we call it, to me, is not that important. It's more the practical effect. And the practical effect, of course, will be that things will stop, whatever the two terminologies. When I hesitate in total disruption, it is with the hope that things can change. We have been in this case with other candidate countries. We were in this situation with Slovakia under the Mizia period, where Slovakia was originally meant as being one of the first wave candidates. We stopped because of the political development. And when development changed in Helsinki, we resumed enlargement negotiations. So in practice, yes, stop, but probably keeping the door open, and in the meantime looking at other aspects of getting closer together, including what we could do on the customs union file. There, of course, also, and that will be a question which will probably figure high on the agenda when the European Council discusses Turkey next week, is that do we offer improved customs union negotiations conditionally or unconditionally? I don't dare to give the answer.
Professor Eralp, obviously coming from Turkey, you have a birdseed view of what the Turkish elites might think about this. But how about this? You yourself said that the EU is no longer as important in Turkey as it once was. Why not reset the relationship and say, okay, we're not trying to get into the EU anymore, but for the EU, Turkey as a country of 100 million is a key partner. It's a key trade partner for many countries. Why not find some new way to cooperate that is sort of outside the strictures of this enlargement process, which is going nowhere, and I think everyone agrees is never going to happen?
Yeah, but one should not forget that the issue of membership has a lot of political symbolism in Turkey. It is a long-lasting aspiration, and here, I mean, as the ambassador was saying, one could shift to the customs union and try to modernize it, but then, will this be accepted by the Turkish governing elites and Turkish, business elites as well? Probably the business elites could say more positively, but how about the, political elites here, It will be, especially as you were saying, if it is conditional on political criteria, because a renewed customs union would be conditional on political criteria. Then what would be the difference in terms of, let's say, accession negotiations and its political criteria and customs union and its political criteria? So it will not be easy to accept, let's say, even a modernized kind of a customs union relationship. Then the whole relationship could evolve into a more conflictual type of a relationship. I mean, and there is even, I would say, a more potential in terms of evolving towards a more conflictual relationship. Then what would be the cost of that for Turkey, but also for Europe? One should think of the cost of Turkey's non-membership, or let's say termination of, we are not talking of membership in the immediate future. We are talking about termination, Termination means that, it will be extremely difficult for Turkey to start negotiations again, legally speaking, institutionally speaking. So then, the Turkey-EU relationship could easily evolve into, or European relationship in general, into a more conflictual relationship. There is that, let's say, important possibility. Then who will bear all the costs, when, as we have been discussing, EU is not involved in a major shift in the case of Poland, Hungary, and others, I mean, it isn't, one should think of all these cases, really, and if you pick up only Turkey and try to create that kind of a conflictual relationship, then it could have all kinds of consequences, not only for Turkey, for Europe, for the neighborhood, So one has to bear all those costs in mind, you know. I mean, there should be an important calculation on all these matters, you know, before one takes that kind of
Right,
important
but I mean,
step.
you could also argue that taking such a drastic step could get countries maybe like the Ukraine to really, you know, push its own reform processes forward. Svitlana, you said before that Ukraine was a late bloomer to EU accession, or in terms of its enthusiasm for it, in contrast, say, to a country like Poland. But why today should the EU, should Brussels, just to play devil's advocate, really take that seriously, given the number of revolutions that you've had there over the past few decades? I mean, wouldn't it? What makes you so convinced, or why do you think the EU should now really be steering Ukraine towards accession?
Yes, just going with this also historical comparison, not trying to simplify though, I think the situation that Ukraine is going through is very different, and the challenges for Ukraine are very different than it was the case in the 1990s with enlargements. And it's important to specify which ones. First, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with the ideas of return to Europe in Central and Eastern and the Baltic sort of region, you had a situation where actually at that time it wasn't that Europe was, or the EU members were that keen to embrace the new members, but there was a moment of hesitation which allowed for the window of opportunity to open. So the contextual situation was quite different, that the EU member states stepped up to that challenge. You also had a very different geopolitical environment. Russia was also preoccupied and not as waging war for seeking these aspirations at that time. That made a difference. And yet, despite these challenges, despite the resistance from EU and despite the Russian actions in Ukraine, you still have a society that aspires to join the EU. Why Europe should care? Well, firstly, it's a direct neighbor of 40, maybe less than 45 million right now, but still of 40 plus million people. You have a talented labor force, which, okay, it's a labor force which is fairly cheap now, but you have a high tech potential. You have a lot of potential that is there. And to make it kind of blunt and simple, modernization it doesn't stay where we leave it off. It's sort of a road. If you don't repair it, invest in it, it doesn't stay the same. It gets much worse. So for Ukraine, if it doesn't capitalize on its opportunity, and a lot of people in Ukraine itself realize it quite well, and we work with these activists every day. But they need support. If this opportunity is not capitalized on now, we may have a very difficult situation, much volatile situation, which will go to the heart of this stability. What is stability? How do we define stability argument? And as I mentioned, that for Ukraine, it has been very difficult to be in this bridge-like position, and it hasn't really worked so well. There has been always a pressure for it to integrate further with Russia. That's why.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to go to the audience now. We have to sort of stay on time so that everybody gets to the airport on time. This gentleman here in the middle on the left-hand side. Yep.
Thank you very much. Stefan Lehne from Carnegie Europe. I think we should look at the three cases together. For me, it's very interesting to see, for instance, on Brexit, maybe we get Canada Plus. Maybe Canada Plus means that the UK wants to be part of Europol, wants to be part of the European research policy. Now, would that maybe at one point be an interesting solution for Turkey? Maybe if there is an important country that is out but closely associated, Turkey will find it easier to adjust to being out but very closely associated. Maybe research policy, that might also be something that might be interested in Ukraine. I think you have now two different visions of Europe. One is the Juncker vision, which is the Europe of the 27, everybody does things together, moving together. But there's this other vision, which I think is at least strongly implied by the Macron statement, of much greater differentiation. And I think this would make, to some extent, enlargement easier, different. It could be sort of a partial, there could be new solutions. And I think it would be useful to have a brief discussion on this kind of perspectives.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just collect a couple of questions. Yes, the woman there, yes.
From the EUI. Can I ask about the role of borders in all of this? Because for a long time, when European integration was driven by law and by rules, borders could be fuzzy because you can export rules with relative ease. And as we know, your EU rules radiate in different ways outside the EU. But when you move to an EU that protects, and when citizens in the EU 27 see high levels of volatility, the return of geopolitics from Putin, problems in the Mediterranean, the core public opinion feeling will be towards more borders and a Europe that protects. And what does that mean for external differentiation? Because of course it's always in the interests of countries on the border of the EU to be brought into the EU, but as we know through history, borders in the end are set politically. They're not set, they're set by politics. And my sense is we're in a period of European integration at the moment where borders are much more salient for the EU, and the citizens of EU member states are less open to fuzziness in borders in ways that were the case, I would say, even 10 years ago. So a response on borders.
Thank you very much. Maybe one more up front here. The woman in the... Oh,
Thank
sorry.
you. Being member of Ukrainian delegation in Parliament, we have been involved in all the developments and really appreciate what Ukraine have been doing. But you well know that there is one crucial issue. Without that, any talk of enlargement will not be possible. That means the issue of the control of own territory. And that means that the whole issue is concerning East Ukraine and then Crimea and so on need to be solved in some way. And in our talks inside in the delegation and so on, we have reached the conclusions that the present format is not giving any results. So what could be maybe from Ukrainian side kind of new initiatives or ideas how we can come to the new situation there, because without that I don't see progress. There could be very well done things inside, you fight corruption, we know you do all things, but this crucial issue, it should be resolved in some way. And that's a very important thing to know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take one more right here in the second row.
I'm the Turkish ambassador in Tallinn, so I would like to share a few views of myself as the representative of official Turkey here.
Please.
And first, I mean, the EU membership has been a strategic choice for Turkey, and it remains so. It is a strategic target. And I'm talking about the membership. And this relationship has never been easy, as some of the speakers mentioned. It's been going on for 60 years, 12 of this were negotiation. But well, the question might be here, did we really negotiate? I mean, 18 chapters were closed, and some of them are very relevant to today's discussions about Turkey, like human rights and freedom of expression, etc. I'm talking about chapter 23, 24. Is there a really genuine interest in the EU when it comes to what's going on in Turkey, or is it just an instrument for Turkey bashing? And the second thing I would like to point, maybe I haven't noticed any reference to the challenges that Turkey has been meeting in the security field. We have been going through a very difficult period, not only for the last 1 year, but longer than that. We've been fighting with PKK. We have war on our border. We are the main target of ISIL, and we're also meeting challenges with Gülen's network in Turkey. And AKP is in power since 2002. It's been the champion of reforms and the start of negotiation, and it just didn't turn into what's going on in Turkey right now. We are going back to normalization. We will go back to normalization. This is extraordinary times, and unfortunately, it is with extraordinary measures. But that doesn't mean that we have to leave the path. It is both our interest and it is also interest of the EU to maintain this tie, and we have to find a way forward, and we have to think what is next then if we terminate this relationship right now.
Okay, thank you. I think we got it. Thank you very much for your comment and question. Maybe Stephen, I'll come straight to you on that, since you were calling for an end to the accession procedure for Turkey. I mean, it's a fair point, this question about is this just an instrument for Turkey bashing? If you look back to 2005, I think it was 2004, 2005, when Angela Merkel came out and made it clear that she would never support EU membership in Turkish membership in the EU, rather, and that really was sort of the beginning of the unraveling of this relationship in many people's view. And we didn't mention the fact there is a war on the Turkish border, just as there is on the Ukrainian border. Does the European Union need to be a little bit more understanding of the pressures in Turkey at the moment when it discusses these accession questions?
I think it already is. Very understanding, but what is left out of this equation is the constitutional reform process, which has been emboldened by the referendum of the 16th of April of this year, which effectively sets Turkey on a track to authoritarianism. We can all look up, political dictionaries, what it means. I think that is exactly what is happening. You have a leader who's amassed so much strength that that he can rule beyond constitutional limits. That is not in line with political criteria that we've agreed at Copenhagen, that we try and maintain internally as well as in the external policy area. Now, that is not to say that taking out a dysfunctional enlargement process out of a much wider strategic relationship between the EU and Turkey is going to be detrimental to that relation. In fact, it could be productive. It might be the type of language which Erdogan and his supporters, as well as EU citizens, understand. I mean, the bureaucratic language of suspension is beyond them, I'm afraid. That is why I think for several of these reasons, I think it's worthwhile doing that. There is a lot of common ground. Turkey is a very important strategic neighbor for the European Union. It's time to reset the relationship on more realistic, yes, transactional grounds, in regional security, on migration, on energy, on modernization of the customs union, and who knows, maybe even visa liberalization, even if the current spat with the US is maybe not indicative of that trend in Turkey. And yes, indeed, also support to civil society organizations. I fully agree with that. So a much more transactional, indeed. What Luc van Middelaar said yesterday is, I think, true. The EU has been forced by its neighbors and is certainly being perceived by its neighbors, as well as the neighbors of our neighbors, Russia in particular, as a power to be reckoned with in the geoeconomic and geopolitical field. And we ought to live up to that. You see trends, inroads being taken there, and I think it's only right. On Stefan's question, whether we should merge Ukraine, Turkey and the UK and build some type of privileged partnership. You didn't mention it, but I suppose that's behind the idea. Again, a singular model of neighborhood relations for those three big strategic countries, which will be in the EU's neighborhood, is, I think, beyond the point, or beside the point, because we have different strategic interests with those countries.
Maybe just to key off of that, and this question, Stefan specifically mentioned Canada and a Canada Plus arrangement as an option for Turkey. possibly. It's been discussed also for the UK. You mentioned it earlier, Ambassador. Is that the kind of thing that could help move things along by offering a country like Turkey and even the Ukraine at some point sort of a different model that's somewhat, it's not full membership, but it's closer to the EU than they are now?
Well, I don't think I suggested a Canadian plus for Ukraine because to some extent...
For the UK, sorry.
For the UK,
right.
the UK certainly. And the plus for me was that it would also include some kind of cooperation on foreign policy and some kind, maybe a strong cooperation on security, home and justice affairs in general. I agree with Stephen that we shouldn't develop a model that one type model we can use everywhere, but I do think that these topics maybe are potential topics for cooperation with each country in its according to its own conditions. And I would like to say, as far as Ukraine is concerned, that because I haven't had the chance to say so, that it is actually impressive the kind of progress which has been made in Ukraine over the past, in particular the past 2 years, in various areas. So when I still say that there's a lot of homework to be done, this doesn't mean that I don't appreciate the progress, and also progress in a very difficult situation where part of the country is occupied. But take an issue like, and it also goes into the question about borders. The EU decided to lift visa restrictions for Ukraine. I think one of the reasons why we were not afraid of lifting visa restrictions with Ukraine was that we have seen over the years that we have had a very effective return agreement for illegal immigrants coming through Ukraine. So we were not afraid that Ukraine would become an alternative transit way into EU. And I think there are areas in the home and justice affairs area where we will have a real interest in collaborating. But besides that, I think that the whole approach to the internal market is an enormous agenda which has a lot of potential. I could even think that at a much later stage one could also think about a customs union for Ukraine, which in economic terms would be favorable. Some of these things also apply to Turkey, but we also know that the visa liberalization is blocked, and it is blocked because Turkey cannot deliver the necessary conditions as far as home and justice affairs are concerned. So there is a potential, but it requires that Turkey delivers.
Can I come to Professor Eralp on that? I know that you wanted to comment. I mean, this question of borders is a very, very interesting one in this context. Obviously, visa liberalization was not just on the table, it was promised to Turkey as part of the refugee deal a couple of years ago, and I think in the Turkish view, the EU has sort of found excuses not to guarantee that, because just as with the Ukraine, there was sort of a record of good progress in returning illegal immigrants and so forth. The same, I believe, was true with Turkey. How do you see this from a Turkish perspective?
I think the issue of borders is really critical, as Bridget also, provoked me to comment on it, and in the case of Turkey, if Turkey is singled out and if there is, let's say, the suspension of talks, what will it mean in terms of the borders, especially if this relationship evolves towards a more conflictual type of a relationship between Europe and Turkey? I think it's an important question because, again, you were making the comment that, one of the weaknesses in Europe is the weakness of politics, On the border issue, who will decide? How will it be decided? And especially if the EU comes to a common position, politically speaking, on Turkey, it would create, as I was saying, conflictual relations, then, it could create also problems at the borders, Will the borders be stable if there is a conflictual relationship between Turkey and the EU is a critical question. And who will decide in Europe on this question? Who will be the political actors deciding on this critical issue? Second issue is this issue of differentiation. I think it is important also from the point of view of Turkey, a model which is based on more differentiation in time, not today, but in time, help Turkey to get closer and to link to the European Union. But the critical question is what will be the institutional mechanisms? And again, on this issue, who will decide is a question mark. Because when you look at the debates on flexible integration, multi-speed, etc., the institutional mechanisms are not discussed, especially in relation to third countries, candidates, and others, So there is a weakness there which should be probably more, it's a challenging issue and it should be addressed more institutionally, I would say. And thirdly, in terms of this transactional relationship, yes, it is in the interest of the EU to create this kind of a transactional relation, but will it be accepted by Turkey, Turkish citizens, Turkish governing elites, Is it, in that sense, politically feasible, really? Yes, it could be a European aspiration, but then, a transactional relationship is a two-way relationship. One should think about it, So, in that sense, is it politically feasible is the critical. Again, what will be the political, let's say, the structure, political actors involved in making that transaction possible is, again, a critical question. I don't think that it's possible, really, this transactional. Because transactional relationship also depends on all kinds of political criteria. Could you create, in your opinion, transactional relationship with a rising authoritarian Turkey? Is, again, a crucial question.
Very, very, very important question. We're running out of time. Svitlana, I'll give the last word to you. There was also this question and comment about the Normandy format and the fact that hasn't really worked out the way anyone had hoped. But if you want to comment maybe on the borders and on that, and we'll close
yes.
up.
So first with borders are political, and I think with having been analyzing Ukraine for a number of years, when it wasn't even so much in the news as it is now, it's interesting to see that for good or for bad, of course, the situation that is now is very difficult. It's not good at all. But it has increased capacities also in Western capitals to analyze Ukraine for the case of Ukraine, not through Russian paradigm. We've had lots of expertise centered on Russia, and Ukraine, as well as other post-Soviet republics, were analyzed as those post-Soviet republics. But now, with so many years being independent, it's the time that now also in EU capitals there is greater expertise on Ukraine itself, which is, I think, positive and will hopefully influence the way that borders are also looked at, because the paradigm through which we look at also limits, even unconsciously, our thinking of what is possible. And this is to actually also Stefan's point. I think that there are many things that can be done while the window of opportunity for membership is not open yet. And there's a lot of new tools that can be further developed and reinvigorated, including, for example, such a simple thing as for further boosting transport links, which would allow for greater trade within and between EU and Ukraine, greater integration and increasing academic mobility, which also boosts circular migration, but would also reinvigorate human capacities. Thinking about how to inject funding into the real economy. At the European Endowment for Democracy, we work in supporting directly grassroots. So I can see big difference when there is a budget support versus support through other means. But there has to be much more creative thinking beyond saying, well, let's just implement what we have, because it's very challenging without membership perspective and attracting huge FDI and also these battles that there are to attract that at this time. And lastly, but very important point, the issue of war and how difficult it is, as I mentioned, to be democratic, pursue, have a nation-building boom, and build the state. All of these things at once that are happening right now. We have to recognize we have Minsk process, and there were 2 Minsk agreements. Every time, even the first Minsk agreement that was negotiated under very difficult conditions. And here, by the way, I'm speaking more as an analyst. I don't live in Ukraine, so I think it's not even fair for me to take credit for representing Ukraine as such. But it's important to understand this nuance. As the first agreement was being negotiated, Russian troops directly intervened in Ukraine, and there was a surrounding of Ukrainian positions in Ilovaisk and the massive losses. And in a way, that first agreement was negotiated as a way out to at least stop these losses from happening. So it was a very difficult one. And the second Minsk agreement, again, we had Debaltseve surrounding, where there were massive losses on the Ukrainian side. So for Ukraine, the understanding is that militarily, of course, it's very difficult to win the war, even when you defend your territory. Of course, the winning doesn't just equalize with the military power, because also when you defend your own territory, the morale is much higher than, let's say, you secretly smuggle your soldiers into someone else's territory and have to find a way to tell mothers not to talk about the losses, right? So, of course, there is a big difference there, but still, for Ukraine to win the war is very difficult. But there has to be a willingness for peace from different sides, right? And this has been a difficult thing. Well, Ukraine initially, I believe, wanted to use Minsk to stabilize the situation and to potentially move forward with having peace. It hasn't happened yet, and every day we hear number of shellings, number of cases. Now there's a new idea of having peacekeepers, but the devil lies in details. The Russian proposal has been to have peacekeepers at the contact line, but we're talking a massive contact line, and then Ukrainian territory that is not under control, and Russian-Ukrainian border. So for Ukraine, it's important to, if there are peacekeepers, to have it an entire territory. Since there's a big stretch there. And the idea of peacekeepers has been there for some time, since 2000.
Right, and that itself is a very controversial question that we could spend the rest of the afternoon discussing. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there. I would ask that everybody remain seated for Professor Anne Dayton's closing address, and Christy is going to come up to introduce her. So thank you to the panel, and thank you to the audience for your questions this afternoon.